Hello and welcome to the monthly recap. This recap is for most of May. And the reason I say most of May is because I'm going to be taking a little bit of time off next week. So I decided to record this a week earlier than I normally would. And in any other environment, I honestly probably could record a week in advance and nobody would notice. But given how quickly things are changing in the market, I can't. So we're releasing it a week early. I apologize in advance. Thank you for bearing with me. But it is a most of May 2026 recap. So lots to get into, okay? So need to talk about what's going on in Iran. Honestly, it's one of the main reasons why I couldn't record this and just release it a week later, because things are going to be different next week. Inevitably so, things are just changing very, very rapidly right now. So going to be talking about where we currently stand. Going to be talking about inflation. What's going on with inflation? It's definitely warming up. What's next? It's going to be very interesting to see. Labor market. Has the labor market found a new normal? And what does that look like? And then a huge month next month. Next month is going to be really, really important. Talk about that extensively as well. Mortgage rates as of Friday, May 22nd, are right around 6.625% for a 30-year fix. So they have increased quite a bit in the last couple of weeks. Memorial Day, obviously on Monday, Cinco de Mayo as well. So hope you all had a wonderful most of May. All right, let's get into it. So let's start with what's going on in Iran. I love this building too. It's such a beautiful building. Anyways, let's talk about Iran. So March was all about military operations. Okay, we all kind of knew that. We all kind of felt that. We all saw that, obviously. April was really about ceasefires, blockades, and then talks starting to come around. Well, May was about diplomacy, patience, and a lot of frustration. So what happened in most of May? Well, the 60-day military operation window has ended officially. The government, the president has given 60 days for military operations without having to get congressional approval. Now that window has ended. Now I say, or has it? And the reason I say that is because what you're hearing from the different sides of the aisle are, well, technically, since there's a ceasefire, the military operation did end. Then there's also talks about, well, even if we had to renew military operations, we could simply call it something else, right? Like, what separates one conflict from another? Like, they could call it something else, a different operation. They could say, hey, this is a new 60-day window, or hey, you know, the window never even started. Like, there's so much going on, battle between the aisles as to what's going on there. But anyways, something tells me that it's probably not going to slow down the administration. They've kind of been kind of doing what they want to been doing anyway. So I don't know that it matters, honestly, so much. Take that as you will. U.S. and Iran traded proposals. Neither one was acceptable to the other party. Not only was neither one acceptable to either party, but they weren't even close to acceptable to either party. More on trading proposals in a little bit. The markets are vacillating throughout the month between optimism of an agreement being made to pessimism of a ceasefire failing. And as you're going to see in two slides here, that's very much been the case even this week, even this single week, that has been the case of vast fluctuations in the market between optimism and pessimism. Talk about that in a little bit. So what happened last week? Trump met with Xi Jinping, the president of China. It was literally only like 48-hour summit. So a lot was made of a very short meeting that they had, only 48 hours. But the hope was that, look, Iran and the U.S. are at an impasse. They have not come to an agreement. They cannot clear out this logjam. They are just stuck. So maybe China can help. China is a very close ally to Iran. They buy a lot of Iranian oil. They rely on Iran, and Iran very heavily relies on them. So maybe China could get in Iran's ear and maybe have them come to the table with a better proposal. Okay, so that's what the hope was. And what we heard coming out of the summit was, not a whole lot happened there. There was still a little bit of optimism that maybe something would come about, but not a whole lot of movement actually happened from the summit itself. The U.S. is in a little bit of a tricky position. They cannot stop blockading the Strait of Hormuz without this being resolved. And the reason why is because it would give Iran such a crucial economic lifeline. If you recall, last month, Iran actually came out and said, hey, look, the Strait of Hormuz is wide open so long as the ceasefire is going on. They would have loved that because that would have given them a huge economic boost. They rely on the Strait of Hormuz for a lot of their money, and without that money, there's blackouts, there's economic straits, recession. I mean, the economy of Iran is really, 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 really dependent on the Strait of Hormuz being open. So the US can't open it or else they lose all their leverage. However, it needs to get open because the world's getting more and more desperate. I've talked about it before. The quality of oil that comes from the Middle East is very different than the quality of oil that the US generates. And they use them for very different things. There's always talks about, possibly having jet fuel shortages because, the oil that comes from Texas is not the same quality as the oil that comes from the Middle East. Not just that, but most oil refineries are not built or suitable to just take care of or really refine U.S. oil or Middle East oil. They tend to be specialized in one category or another, and they're not really adapted to be able to change which oil they are refining. So that's another little bit of a problem. Just because, hey, look, the US could produce a lot of oil and maybe fill in some of those holes, well, that doesn't necessarily mean that every country could import that, even if they wanted to. It's just a very different quality of oil. It requires different refineries to be able to handle it. So the world is getting more desperate. The US can't not blockade Hormuz, or they lose literally all of their leverage. Rhetoric is definitely getting more inflammatory as the US weighs additional military action, to which this week has been crazy. So on 5/18, Trump said he was an hour away from launching an additional attacks on Iran. But 3 Gulf countries, they didn't say which ones, but 3 Gulf countries said, hey, look, can we have a pause to this? Because there's ongoing talks and you might be, pulling the rug out from their feet right before things start to actually pick up momentum. So 5/18, sounded kind of pessimistic, only an hour away from launching additional attacks, but then optimism of, hey, look, we're going to pause those attacks due to ongoing talks. Then, literally one day later, Trump said he'd delay attacking until maybe early next week. Well, that's not very comforting. The market saw that and they started getting spooked. Like, maybe next week? That's not very far. Like, what's going to happen next week? What do you know that we don't know? So, pessimism, optimism, pessimism again. And then on 5/20, literally a day later, Trump said that the war with Iran is in the final stages. Well, that's optimism. So the markets were very happy about that. But then he also came back and said, but he's in no hurry to make a deal. So pessimism that this might drag on and drag on and drag on. And then 5/21, literally in the last day or two, concerns are growing about Iran's drone building. They've apparently been building more drones even during the ceasefire, which seems to mean that they're amping up for further military operations, whatever that might mean, and that the ongoing talks that they were alluding to back on 5/18 are yielding very little. The latest news that we've heard from those ongoing talks is that Iran does not want to ship off their enriched uranium, and they also want to continue to control the Strait of Hormuz so that they can enact tolls on ships that are passing through. So optimism, pessimism, optimism, pessimism, optimism, pessimism. The markets are just getting frustrated. They're getting sick of it. They're sick of this show, this rigmarole. They're just overwhelmed by it and sick of it. And that's why we've seen so much volatility in the markets, especially this week. So this week is a little bit of a microcosm of what we've been seeing over the last, honestly, 3 months. Optimism, pessimism, and the markets vacillating drastically depending on what's going on in any given day. So let's talk about inflation. So it was a rough month for inflation, okay? Up until these latest numbers, the inflation really had been hitting the headline figures, which is all-in inflation, but not hitting the core readings, which is when you remove volatile food and energy from it. Now, over time, increases in energy prices will bleed over into core inflation. Even though core inflation removes volatile food and energy from the equation, everything you have shipped to your house, every consumer good, everything that gets shipped to Walmart, Best Buy, any shopping store at all, it costs oil. So even if it's not necessarily being directly reflected in the core reading, it still over time bleeds into the core reading when we have these gigantic increases in gas prices. Hopefully that makes sense. Well, this is the first time where we've seen that bleed over effect really take fruit, really go into effect. So consumer price index, which is, again, consumer level inflation, headline for April, which is all inflation, was up 0.6%, but the core reading was up 0.4%. That's not that far off. And it clearly shows that the rise in energy prices is now bleeding over to core inflation, not just limited to the headline inflation. That's the big difference from these April figures compared to like the March figures. March, February, all of that was kind of insulated and we really didn't see a bleed over effect. We are clearly seeing that bleed over effect now. Headline core consumer price index inflation, the yearly increase from 3.3 to 3.8%. That's a huge increase. On the core level, again, the consumer level, the inflation increased from 2.6 to 2.8%. The Fed wants core CPI to get down to 2%. So we are still quite a ways away from their long-term goal, okay? Producer price index, even worse, okay? Producer price index is wholesale inflation, so business level inflation. The headline increased 1.4% in the month. That is crazy. That is a huge number. I don't know if I've ever seen numbers like that. I mean, COVID-19, we saw some pretty wild numbers, but geez, that is something else. That's like a yearly figure, but this is literally in 1 month. Expectation was only for a 0.5% increase, and increased 3 times that almost at 1.4%. The yearly increase to 6%. Expectation was for 4.9%. Ouch. And again, same thing as we saw on CPI, we're now seeing this bleed over effect where it's not just affecting the headline figures, but it's starting to bleed over into the core readings as well. Core for April was up 1%. The yearly increase to 5.2%. Expectation was only for 4.3%. So ouchie, 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 ouchie. It's very clear that businesses are feeling it more than consumers. True. That's starting to get passed along to consumers. Yes. And not just all of that, but again, it's bleeding over from not just the headline figure, but also to core inflation as well. Rough. I wish I had some green in here. I wish I had some positive news. This comic kind of sums it up. Regular gas. Are you kidding me? Premium. You don't want to know. Ultra, forget about it. That's how expensive gas is right now if you've been to the gas pump. Personal consumption expenditures, which is the Fed's favorite measure of inflation, PCE, that is on docket for next week. The markets do have extremely low expectations for those figures. They saw what happened to PPI. They saw what happened to CPI. They are not expecting any miracles to happen on the personal consumption expenditures figure. So more on inflation in a little bit here because we're going to be talking about a big Fed meeting coming up in June, and it's going to be really, really relevant for that. Before I get to that, let's talk about the jobs market. So the jobs market is actually looking a little bit resilient. Ish. Okay, I'll throw in an ish there. So let's start with the good things. Okay, so job expectations for April from Bureau of Labor Statistics, they were only expecting 62,000 job gains. Well, that came in quite a bit higher, as you will see, at 115,000 job gains. So good news there. Bad news, the February figures were revised significantly lower. They were at 92,000 job losses. Those were actually revised lower to 156,000 job losses. So that's not great. The unemployment rate stayed the same at 4.3%. The U6 unemployment rate, which is those who are marginally attached to the employment market, okay, that includes not just those who are unemployed, but also those who are partially employed, those who are employed part-time, but they want full-time work, okay? That did increase from 8% to 8.2%. So bit of a miss there. That wasn't great to see. It means that a lot of the jobs that are being gained are part-time jobs. People want full-time jobs. They're only able to find part-time work. But still, 115,000 job gains. That's really good compared to what they were expecting. ADP had a very similar number. They had 109,000 job creations in April. There's only, it's also worth noting that 65,000 came from small businesses. Why is that important? Well, that's really important because the last few jobs reports, what we've noticed the largest amount of job gains in healthcare and education. Okay, healthcare and education, and those are seen as recessionary-proof industries, right, or sectors. People are always going to get sick. People are always going to need education, right? And that's two things that are always the same. And they're not reliant on a strong economy. Small businesses absolutely are. So I wanted to call that out. The fact that 65,000 of the job gains came from small business is a very positive move. Love that. Now, one last thing I want to throw in here real fast is that they released job cuts. It's called the Challenger Jobs Cut Report, and it shows how many job cuts there are in any given month. There was 83,000 job cuts in April. That was a pretty high number. But what I really want to call out was that AI was the #1 reason given. And this has been the case for the last few months. So it does seem like we're going through a little bit of an AI revolution right now. A lot of employers are streamlining things as AI can kind of eliminate some jobs. So worth keeping an eye on that. Now, I mentioned at the outset, like, are we finding a new normal? 115,000 job gains, 109,000 job gains. That's not a blockbuster number. I mean, we've certainly seen job gains in the past where we're like over $300,000 at some points. So this might be a new normal. This might be a new normal in this post-pandemic AI-driven world that we're currently in. we're going to have to kind of recalibrate our expectations. It's going to be very interesting to see what these numbers look like going forward, but there's been a lot of talk that these might be more normal numbers that we're used to seeing, which means expectations should be coming down a little bit, given what's currently going on. All right, I wanted to talk about the Fed. So we have a really, really big Fed meeting on June 17th. Going to be a critically important one for a couple of reasons, which I'll talk about. It is also a meeting associated with the summary of economic projections. So there's more minor meetings like the one we had in April and January, and then there's the more significant meetings, which we have 4 times a year. June 17th is the second one of those meetings. So going to be very, very important. And it's going to be important because Kevin Warsh is going to be our new Fed chair. He served on the Fed Board of Governors from 2006 to 2011. He's only 35 years old, so he's very, very young. Used to be quite hawkish, but now he's been changing his tune as of late. Okay, so if you recall, doves are in favor of focusing on employment and focusing less on inflation. Hawks are more concerned with inflation, less concerned about the labor market. So he used to be concerned more about inflation. He's been changing his tune as of late, which means he's going to have a very tough challenge ahead of him, as you're going to see here in a second. Of the top candidates, he seemed to be a more moderate choice, policy-wise, not politically, definitely not politically, but policy-wise, he seems to be a pretty moderate candidate. He did serve as an economist under George W. Bush. He's currently a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution, although I do believe he had to terminate that with his new role. All right, so let's talk about this really critically important Fed meeting on the 17th. So in March, there was one dissenter that wanted a rate cut. In April, there was 4 dissenters. One wanted a rate cut, and 3 of them actually said, hey, we don't necessarily like this language in the Fed statement. We might be actually more keen to look at rate hikes instead of rate cuts. So that's what he's walking into. He's walking into a very, very divided Fed. 4 dissenters at the last meeting. It'll be very interesting to see how many dissenters there are in this next meeting. He has officially been confirmed as the new Fed chair. His first meeting that he's going to be overseeing is indeed this June 17th meeting. The administration wants rate cuts, okay? But with the Strait of Hormuz being locked down and inflation running really, really hot, as you just saw a few slides ago, what can he really do? It's going to be a very tricky position to be in. There's been a lot of talk about the independence of the Fed, and especially came to light when the relationship between Jerome Powell, the previous Fed chair, I guess I can now say previous Fed chair, and the administration became very strained. So there was a lot of pressure from the administration on Jerome Powell to cut rates, cut rates, cut rates, cut rates. A lot of tension is going to be on this meeting to find out if they do cut rates or not. If the Fed cuts rates, with inflation being as elevated as it is, it'll be a signal that there's a divergence occurring from the previous database approach. And that could mean 2 different things. And I want to make this very clear. That could mean 2 different things. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're ignoring data altogether, although that is one thing that it could mean, is that they're just ignoring the data, less likely. But the second thing it could mean is that they are prioritizing different data. Maybe they're looking at the Strait of Hormuz as a blip, as a one-off, as a worldwide event, but it's not going to be long-term inflationary. Okay, they could be seeing it that way. They could prioritize literally different data sets to try to come up with that instead of relying so much on PCE or CPI. Maybe they look at some of these other inflation metrics like trueflation that have more tame, cooler numbers. So again, it can mean 2 different things. It can mean they're ignoring the data altogether, less likely. It could also mean that they're prioritizing different sets of data. If the Fed leaves rates unchanged, it'd be very interesting to see if Warsh gets the same theory that Powell did under the administration. I'm also going to say that's very unlikely, considering the administration's the one that wanted Warsh to take his role. But how long can he keep him at bay? Can be very, very interesting. And then how does the Fed statement and the guidance change with the new Fed chair? Since it is a larger meeting, they don't just come out with their Fed decision, but they have to back it all up with their data. They have to show their work, so to speak. So, going to be a very, very intriguing meeting. Yeah, I'm gonna be all over that like white on rice. All right, so looking ahead, what's next for Iran? Obviously, that's going to be critically important for June. Inflation, jobs, they're going to continue to be closely watched. New Fed chair, he's got his work cut out from him. He's inheriting a divided Fed with very elevated inflation numbers, and normally would mean hiking rates, which nobody expected at the beginning of the year because nobody saw Iran happening, right? And then what surprises does June have? Inevitably, there's going to be some in store. I think that's it. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. I hope you all had a wonderful most of the month, and I will see you next month. Thank you all so very, very much for all of your support. It means the world to me and my team. We rely on it. It keeps us in business. So thank you all so much for your continued referrals. We never, 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 never take them for granted. So thank you all so much. Appreciate you. I will see you next time. Thanks. Bye.